Oh, interesting. Okay. Huh. I'm watching a lot of drop frames. So I wonder if my machine here is just not able to keep up with the stream. My data rate is very low. Okay, so are you guys getting something reasonable now? I'm still seeing a ton of drop frames, so my apologies for the terrible audio, or sorry, terrible video. Ibrahim, are you watching right now? So I'm not able to actually see myself over on Twitch. Okay, it's a little better. Is it better enough that we can try to make this work? All right, we're going to give it a try. Okay, we're live-ish. So, guys, my sincere apologies for the technical issues. I'm going to put this away. Okay. So, we were going to talk about the game biz, which I've been a part of for kind of a frighteningly long time. It's strange. Oh, good. Oh, it's good to hear that you guys are maybe actually getting a reasonable stream out of this now. For a long time when I was in the biz, for a long time in the biz, I thought of myself as a young guy because I kind of started out as the young guy in my first couple of gigs. And I sort of maintained that mindset for the better part of 3.5 decades. And then one day I woke up and I was one of the old guys. Oh, yay, we're not buffering. Oh my gosh, we could actually run a stream here. Victory. So that's great news. So I guess first I'd like to just give you the 30-second version of who the hell am I and why should you listen to anything I have to say when it comes to the game biz and possibly game design. And I'll try to keep it short because I don't really want to sit here for a half an hour and bore you guys with my resume. But the short version is I started out as an engineer in the defense business way long time ago, making airborne hardware and software for outfits like the U.S. Air Force and the German Air Force and actually the Norwegian Air Force, and also doing simulation stuff. I did a pretty big project for the Army back in the day. And it was essentially a video game. If you guys have ever heard of the Miles system, I don't know if you have, but it was kind of the original laser tag, right? The whole idea was you stick a laser on a soldier's rifle, and then you can tell whether or not he actually hit something when he shot at it. And if you do that with a whole bunch of soldiers and you put them out in the field, you can do experiments on how soldiers and helicopters and tanks and jeeps and all of that hardware actually works together in the field. And I was one of the designers of the Miles 2 system, which was the improved version of that collection of hardware. And back in the late 80s, I was asked by someone if I wanted to make a video game. And since I was a guy who made video games or played video games a lot, I thought that would be a really cool idea. So I quit my job in the defense business and went off to make a video game and never really looked back. So that was in 1987, and I've been doing it ever since. That first game, by the way, was a game called Pool of Radiance. Actually, I think I even have, let me see if I can do this. Ooh, I'm doing streaming things here. Let me, bear with me for a second. I've never tried to do this live, so if I mess this up, I blame myself. Oh, it's buffering. Okay. Drat. Okay, well, I guess I won't bother showing you that, guys. So I guess I'm buffering again. Hopefully we can get through something useful with this. Anyway, the first game I did was a game called Pool of Radiance. It was one of the first kind of big ambitious role-playing games on the PC, back when the PC was kind of a new thing. That led eventually to working on other PC games, notably simulation games. Yes, it was a 2D game. Yeah. Okay, so the buffering comes and goes. I must have bandwidth issues here. I just moved into a new place, so most likely I'm having internet follies, and again, my apologies. So yes, it was a 2D game. Pool of Radiance was a tile-based system. It was also turn-based, and it was intended to be a faithful representation of pen and paper Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And yeah, it was actually an interesting experience for all of us on that project. It was the biggest project the company I was working for had ever done. That was a company called SSI, or Strategic Simulations. And up until that point, they had made basically war games. They had done, little hex-based games where you drove stuff around on a map and fought either a computer or another opponent. And doing a role-playing game was a really, really big transition for the company. It was interesting because up to that point, they mostly worked with 1- and 2-man teams. And I guess this kind of loops into the whole thing about the game biz. So I'll forget my resume for a minute. We'll talk about the game biz. So back when I started, and you could argue that I was kind of part of the second wave of people who came into the business. The guys that were ahead of me were guys like Nolan Bushnell, the guy that created Pong. Teams were basically like a guy. And most of the games published by SSI in those days were done by a single person. And they literally did everything. They did the art, they did the sound, they did all of it. I mean, some of them even wrote the manuals. And then we decided to do Pool of Radiance. And Pool of Radiance had an actual team. And we had, 15, 20 people working on it. We had artists, we had an art manager, we had a sound guy. We'd never had a sound guy before. We didn't even know what that was like. We had people working on the Commodore 64 version. We had people working on the PC version. We had a guy coming in to do the Amiga port. So it was this profound change in the way we made games. And we, at the time, to be completely honest, none of us really knew anything about managing the process of making games in those days. We didn't have a pipeline. We didn't have a test process. We knew nothing about making software other than what we had learned in other industries. And so I had a little bit of an advantage because I was a guy who came out of the defense biz, where even back in those days they were pretty rigorous about making sure that your software did what you said it did. And so I think that helped us a little bit because it sort of aligned me to a certain way of making software. Not that it was essentially hidebound or that it was overly elaborate, but I simply had become used to having somebody from QA want to see what I did and go through a process of validating what I'd written. And so there was a bit of a struggle about that for those of us who were working on that project, because there were a lot of people who had been at SSI for a long time who weren't really comfortable with that. They weren't used to having somebody say, well, show me and show me that it works. QA wasn't even a thing. I mean, when I started at SSI, there was literally no QA. didn't exist. QA was basically being done by the designers and the production guys. And I'm not saying they did a bad job. What I'm saying is it was vastly less formal than it was even 5 years later. So we learned a ton. We made pretty much every mistake you can possibly make in the course of making that game. But at the end of it, it actually turned out to be a pretty fun game. And it did a pretty good job of simulating the way AD&D operated. Now, to be fair, it wasn't the same thing as playing pen and paper Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. It was nothing like that. But it was an entertaining experience, and it did kind of feel and smell like AD&D. The rules, more or less, were faithful to the pen and paper game. And people liked it. And so we made more of them. And by the time I left SSI a few years later, we had done 3 AD&D titles and a couple of related titles built on top of the same tech. And while we didn't really invent the turn-based RPG, actually the turn-based story-heavy RPG, we were certainly contributors to that. And it was a really educational experience for us, and it was really fun. And we had a great time. It was a group of about 20 of us who worked ridiculously hard and built something that hadn't quite really been built before. And that was a very exciting thing to do. And by the way, not only did we work really hard, but we were working under, I guess what you would say, were less than ideal conditions. For most of that project, my programming buddy and I literally sat in the phone closet. That was our office. So we were in this unventilated little room that had one wall that was basically just a bank of phone jacks. And we had 2 computers in there and a mini fridge, and we just didn't come out of our troll cave unless we absolutely had to. But it was a fun ride. That led me to an opportunity to work on one of the big simulations of that era. It was a game called Falcon 3.0. Anybody who's been a flight simulator geek has probably at least heard of that game. It was a simulation of the F-16, and it was a pretty good simulation of the F-16, especially considering the technology at the time. And in fact, it was good enough that the folks at General Dynamics, the company that builds F-16s, asked us to come down to their plant in Texas and help them redesign their training systems that they used to train pilots to fly the F-16. And I thought that was a pretty cool thing. It wasn't so much that our simulation was more numerically correct than theirs. What it was more authentic than theirs. It felt more like flying an F-16 than the big expensive simulators that they had built for themselves and that they were using to teach pilots sort of the basics of procedure in an F-16 cockpit. But what we gave them was more of a sense of what it's like to fly in combat, and General Dynamics really, really liked that. So we went down there and spent several days with those guys, kind of walking them through how we thought about simulation and how that's kind of different from creating the impression of authenticity. And that actually came into play later in my career when I was at Microsoft. That was the time on Falcon 3 when I really started to learn that there's a profound difference between accuracy and authenticity. Those are not the same thing at all. And in fact, quite often, accuracy in the context of something on a video game console or on a personal computer will effectively mislead the user into gaining a false impression of what the experience is really like. And in fact, many years later, when I was at Microsoft, I used to give a talk to college students every year called "Everything You Know Is Wrong," and the entire presentation was about specifically that subject. That there's this difference between creating an impression of authenticity and mimicking the numerical states of reality. Now I'll do a little sidebar here and give you just a really quick sort of capsule of what I mean by that. So if you're sitting about as far away from your screen as I am right now, which at the moment is about a meter away, if I take a point from the bridge of my nose and I draw a pyramid to the corners of the screen, the angle subtended horizontally by that pyramid is 30, 40 degrees, depending on how close I am to the screen. So from a standpoint of correctness, whatever I see on that screen should be projected as if that was the view frustum through which I was looking. The problem with that is that if I'm doing that in a flight simulator, I've now put myself in a position where I've essentially put blinders on my vision and made it nearly impossible to experience flight the way a real pilot does. When you're really in the cockpit and you're really out there and you're yarding that plane around the sky, you have a vastly wider field of view to work with. And in fact, you can look up and down, you can look left and right. When you're pulling in a hard turn, trying to put guns on an opponent in a real fighter aircraft, you're not looking at the front of the cockpit. You're looking at the top of the cockpit. And that's a thing that is very difficult to do on a computer because of the constraints of the projection that you're using and the hardware you're projecting on. And so what you do as a designer of those kinds of experience is you cheat. And so in a combat simulation, for example, we would use a fairly wide projection to give players an improved degree of situational awareness. They can see more stuff, right? But then, because that projection is true, the brain won't accept it. Yeah, no, you're right. That's part of the problem. But the projection also creates a situation where if you go very wide angle, everything that's in the center of that projection is really, really tiny and becomes essentially impossible to see. So yeah, at the very best, what you're seeing is dots. In the real world, if you were looking at the same things at the same distance, they would look like airplanes or they would look like trees or whatever they were. They would be easily discerned as what they are. But the problem is, because of the projection you're using, they're tiny. And so if you want to make the experience useful to a player, if you want to make it manageable or playable, well, what do? You can either narrow the projection, which means you have very limited visibility peripherally, or you can make things bigger, which is what we did. So on Combat Flight Simulator, for example, when I was at Microsoft, we scaled everything in the center of the view up by like 5x. And as you got closer to the edge of the view, that scaling was sort of carefully tapered down. So if you're flying behind somebody and he's 100 meters away from you, it looks like an airplane, and you can see which direction he's flying, and you can see what he's doing, and you can see the smoke coming off his wing, and all of that stuff is now visible to you. Whereas, given the projection without modification, you would never have seen any of that. You would have seen a pixel. And so that's like a little tiny example of the 8 billion ways accuracy can turn out to be kind of a false impression for players. And this happens all the time. You see it in Call of Duty, you see it in Flight Simulator, you see it in any action game you want to mention. All of these games, every game that I've ever had anything to do with, has in some fashion cheated reality versus playability. And so the focus becomes being faithful to the impression you want to create, as opposed to simply replicating the real world, because you can't do it, right? The device you're doing it on isn't capable of that. Now, obviously, VR changes that, and I think ultimately will probably change it in really profound and powerful ways. But for most people, we're still a ways off with VR for a whole range of technical reasons that I'm sure many of you are already well acquainted with. I've been around VR for a long time. In fact, when I was working on Falcon 3, we actually did a VR version of the simulator that we built, and we packaged it up for the California Air National Guard. And they were excited as hell. They loved that thing, right? Except that they very quickly discovered that you could put a veteran pilot into that head-mounted display and have him start flying around, and within a few minutes, he'd be throwing up in a trash can, because the tech just wasn't really up to the demands of what it was trying to show the pilot. Now, we've gotten way better than that now. Modern VR is becoming pretty sophisticated, and that's an exciting thing. But I'll be honest, guys, I think we're still a ways off, right? I mean, motion sickness in VR is still a huge issue for a lot of people. And pretty much in all cases, motion sickness is a result of discontinuities between what your eyes are picking up and what your inner ear is telling you. And we haven't really solved that problem yet, so we aren't really at the point of sort of ubiquitous VR for that and some other reasons. Will we get there? Sure. Is it going to take a while? Yeah, it'll be a while. So in the meantime, those of us who make games, we have to find clever ways to emphasize authenticity, but sometimes de-emphasize reality. So just to recap a little bit on my background, after SSI, I worked on Falcon 3, and then I went to Sega and spent many years at Sega during the halcyon days of Sonic. And that was my first experience working for a Japanese company. Sega, some people have said that Sega was the least Japanese game company of its time. And I kind of get what they mean by that, because I think Nakayama was the chairman of Sega, was a more sort of internationally minded guy. He wasn't just a Japanese businessman. He was really interested in having Sega become a sort of universal brand in the game biz. And so I think he was probably a little more willing to take chances. He was a little bit more open to kind of international ways of thinking about his business. In retrospect, I think that was both a good thing and a bad thing. The good news was it gave him the momentum, the impetus to take Sega through its transition to the Genesis, the Mega Drive, which was a pretty big deal at the time. I mean, there was a time in the early 90s when Sega was at the top of the heap. It had actually eclipsed Nintendo. And that was a tremendous accomplishment. But it also put him into the mindset of sometimes being willing to take chances that the company might not have been ready for. And in fact, there was a period of time between about 1991 and 1994 when, those of us who know anything about the history of the business know that was a time when Sega started to get itself into some very risky places. If you know anything about the history of the Mega Drive or the Sega, the Genesis, you know that it wasn't long after the release of the Genesis and the massive success of Sonic the Hedgehog. Yes, that's exactly right. Sega was right at the top of the industry. There was an all hands meeting that was held at Sega of America, where they announced the fact that Sega had actually eclipsed Nintendo in hardware sales, and that was in 1990. So yeah, you're spot on. But if you know what happened after that, I mean, it's kind of an interesting case study in kind of the good news and the bad news about being at the top of the heap, right? I mean, if you're at the top of the heap, the only direction you have available to you is down, unless you can figure out a way to make the heap bigger. So the next step was a thing called Sega CD. It was called Sega CD in North America and Europe. And it was an ambitious idea. We're going to take a CD-ROM, which at the time was a crazy new thing, and we're going to make it the storage device for the Genesis. And not only are we going to do that, but we're going to put like a whole other computer in that CD-ROM device so that it can do all this other processing to make bigger and more capable games. And everybody who heard that said, whoa, that's going to be amazing. And in some respects, it really was. But there are a whole bunch of things about that that are really hard. I'll start with the kind of basics. So at the time, if you wanted to make a CD-ROM, how would you do it? Well, turned out the only way we could do it was with a device that was made by Panasonic, I think. I don't remember now. Might have been Toshiba. I'm sorry, I can't remember. Made by a Japanese company that was one of the leaders in early CD-ROM technology. It was a CD-ROM writer that weighed about 40 pounds. It was 19-inch rack mount, so it was about this wide, about that deep, about that high, weighed about 40 pounds, and cost $50,000. And as a technical director at Sega, one of the things I had to do was go to Japan and learn how to use that thing, and then bring it home, because there weren't any in the United States. They literally didn't exist. So, right out of the gate, there's hard thing number one. How do you make a CD-ROM? Sony was doing it too, but there were other manufacturers that were building CD-ROM writers. And Sony and Sega, even at that time, were in this kind of wary rivalry position, which only got amplified later. So that's a great question. Sony was a leader in the field, but we weren't using Sony CD-ROM writers. So I actually had to come through customs with this thing in a box, and the guy at customs is like, "What the hell is that?" And I said, "It's electronic equipment." He's like, "What kind of electronic equipment?" And I said, "It plays CDs." And he goes, "Huh, how much is it worth?" And I said, "Oh, I think it's about $1,000. And he's like, "Okay, well, pay duty on it and you can go." So I probably have a federal crime on my rap sheet now, but that's what I did. So we got it home and we started learning how to make CD-ROMs. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. There were a whole bunch of things about Sega CD that were actually really challenging. Continuing with, I've got 650 megabytes. Well, actually, it's more like 500 megabytes of storage on this thing, on a machine that's used to having a few megabytes of storage. Well, okay, what am I gonna do it? It's not a boom. That's good. So suddenly, all the designers at Sega were scratching their heads, going, "What do we do with all that? We're going to fill it up with levels? How am I going to build those levels?" Right? I mean, at that time, levels got built on graph paper, and then a coder would sit down and type a bunch of numbers into an editor to make a level. And then they would do a build, and they would try it and see if it did what they wanted it to do. So you can't do that. So now you got to come up with another way of making levels. Yikes. Okay, well, that's a problem. And then what do you do about the fact that you're now dealing with two separate computers that have to talk to each other through this fairly complex interface? And it, in fact, is a very complex interface. And oh, by the way, the people who are coding for this thing, trying to get ready for the launch, yes, actually, PS5, we're going to be facing some issues on that one as well. And actually, I was going to loop back to that. And Troy, thanks for bringing that up. This is not new news. The story I'm telling you about Sega CD it repeats every generation, right? There's always something about the new generation of hardware that makes the designers and the engineers go, that's going to be a problem. It never fails. Now, I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing. It just is, right? You're making significant changes to the hardware, and you're usually introducing a new big thing that can make it much more difficult to make a game the way you've been making it. So you got to change how you do it. And that certainly happened to us with Sega CD. And then on top of that, the hardware wasn't really done. The documentation was all in Japanese, and despite our best efforts, most people at Sega of America couldn't read Japanese. So we started hiring translators because the guys in Japan were working their butts off. They just couldn't keep up. So, yeah, you're right. Oh, yeah, and by the way, you can't spend more making the game. That's so true. So it got so bad for us at Sega of America that we were literally hiring anyone who said they could translate Japanese to English. And what we very quickly discovered is that technical translators and just translators are completely different people. So we ended up with translations that would say things that were in some fashion linguistically correct, but they were completely incomprehensible. You know, you would have a piece of documentation that would talk about raising the spirit of a particular input on a device, and what they meant was switching from 0 volts to 5 volts. But unless you knew that, some of these documents were completely unreadable because they simply used the wrong words because they didn't know any better. So on top of all that, Sega CD actually had a hardware problem. And it was a hardware problem that wasn't really the fault of the hardware. So here we are, we're in a screaming crunch to get Sega CD launched. And we're down to the wire, man. I mean, the big announcement in New York is going to happen, I don't know, like a week out. Maybe it was more like 2 weeks. So we're trying to be ready and to have demos and really make a splash. All of those games were in QA. And suddenly we started getting reports out of QA about Sega CDs catching fire. And I don't mean that figuratively, I mean literally. Literally, smoke would come out of them and then flames would shoot out the back of the unit. And you can imagine that got a lot of people panicked real quick. Long story short, it turned out that the reason that was happening is that the people that were making games for Sega CD hadn't really read the specs very carefully on the CD-ROM device. And this device, for cost reasons, was actually just a commercial grade CD player. That's literally all it was. I mean, it had some extra logic, but the drive was just a music player. And so the amount of time you could spend doing a seek, moving the head across the CD, was around 5%. And in some of these games, they were seeking 95 to 98% of the time because they were picking off data in places they wanted it from the disk. And so after a while, the drive circuit for the head would get really, really hot, and there was a big electrolytic capacitor on that drive circuit that would eventually just get so hot it would explode, and then hot oil would spew all over the board, and it would catch fire, and the whole thing would burn to the ground. So my point in that is that, as Troy points out, the introduction of a new piece of hardware can introduce a whole raft of surprising problems. And you're almost never ready for it. You can plan like a crazy. Uh-oh. Sounds like I'm having uphill problems again. Sorry, guys. I'll keep going. And hopefully it settles back out. I'm going to have to figure out a way to improve on my uphill bandwidth. The degree to which you can be prepared for this is not zero, but it's also not 100%. You're always going to run into stuff on every new generation that you simply didn't anticipate. And it's why launch titles have a tendency not to show the hardware as as effectively as everybody would like. It's really, really difficult to be sophisticated about how you use that new hardware without having spent a fair amount of time shipping product on it. And that's why late generation titles tend to be sometimes astonishingly better than the launch wave, because people have had time to get clever about using the hardware to do amazing things. So I'll back away from that little sidebar for now. Going back to my time in the business, actually while I was at Sega, an old friend of mine happened to be in the building, and we were catching up, and he said, "Hey, so we're spinning up a studio in Central Oregon." I'm like, I don't even know what Central Oregon is. I mean, at that point, I don't think I'd ever been to Oregon. And we want you to come be our tech director. And I said, yeah, that sounds interesting. So I went up and looked around. I'm like, oh my gosh, this place is amazing. And I helped spin up a studio. That studio is now part of Sony. They're called Sony Bend. They're the guys that did Days Gone. I don't get to take any credit at all for that game. But some of the guys that I worked with are still there, and they're doing amazing work, and I'm very proud of them. So I spent some time there, and oh, really? Oh, it's only but it's on Twitch as well. Oh, sorry guys. Well, I'll keep going until somebody tells me that it's just intolerable, and hopefully it'll settle back out. Well, Troy, I hope you're right about the wisdom. And we're talking about the biz and about my personal experiences in the biz. So right now, I'm just basically telling stories. When I was at the studio that is now Sony Bend, we, like a lot of small studios, we spread ourselves a little too thin. We got in a situation where we had more than one project going. We actually had spun up a second team. And then our publisher got into financial issues and killed one of our projects. And if you've ever worked in a small studio, you know that can be catastrophic, because most studios just don't have enough money in the bank to withstand losing half their income. And so we killed the project because the publisher shut down the funding because they were running out of money. And okay, you want me to move on to the business side? Okay, all right. I'll wrap this up really quickly. Long story short, I elected to keep my interest in the studio, but to move on, I ended up at Microsoft, where I ran one of the studios that helped launch the Xbox, the original one. And that, by the way, is where Troy Dunaway and I got to know each other. Troy was part of my crew, and even way back then, one of the most design-savvy guys I know. So this has been kind of a neat reunion for me, because we haven't really had a chance to work together for a long time, but here we are. So let's talk about the business and how that relates to game design. And there's a bunch of different ways we can come at this. As you might imagine, game design has a huge impact on the business side of games. So I'm seeing a suggestion to try lowering the resolution. I actually did do that, and although at the moment I'm still streaming it at HD, I think I have to shut it down in order to change the resolution. Troy, I'd like a little advice, a little wisdom from you on whether we should try to do that. I don't know that I can change resolution. Let me see. Can I do that on the fly? No, I can't. It won't let me do it. I have reduced the bit rate, I could try reducing it further. Let's see what happens if I do that. And this might get blocky and kind of ugly. Is that helping at all on bitrate? Maybe? No? Should I keep going? Yeah, poor Troy. He's really under the weather today. So, okay. I will assume for the moment that I can keep going on talking about the business and design. So let's. I'm sure those of you who are working with Troy, I'm sure you've in some fashion already talked about the intersection of design and the game business. But I'll take a stab at a couple of things that I personally think are really interesting. In my mind, there are sort of two big chunks of those interactions. And just to make sure I'm being clear about this, I'm talking about the relationship between design and the business nature, environment, success, or otherwise of games. Those two big chunks have to do with the player experience and the way you make the game. Both of those are critically important to a game's success. Let me just take a little stab at the player experience. I actually have a list which I'm not in a position to trot out right now, but it's my list of 10 little nuggets of wisdom that I've collected over the years about game design. At the very top of that list is a reminder about how the business works. I'll try to explain what I mean by that. This actually goes back to my very first game developer conference, which was held at the San Jose Ramada back in '88, I think. So here I am at the Ramada in North San Jose, and I'm running around and I'm going to things and I'm talking to people and I'm having a great time. And at one point, I stopped to just take a break for a second, and I sat down on this couch, and the couch was backed up to a bunch of potted plants. So there's like all these ferns and stuff behind me. And then on the other side of those ferns was another couch. And I could hear two guys on the couch behind me, but we couldn't see each other. I could just hear their voices. And they're talking, and it became pretty obvious pretty quickly that these two guys were coders. They were programmers. And they were obviously in the crunch. So they're basically, the conversation is like, yeah, my wife's really mad at me because I'm never home because we're crunching all this time. And so they were commiserating about how tough it can be when you're in the crunch. And then one of them said, yeah, nobody cares how hard we work. All they want is their damn game. And that was a big aha moment for me because it suddenly made me realize that that's true. Nobody cares. No consumer gives a flying hoot how hard it is to make what we make. They don't care how long it takes. They don't care what it costs you. They just don't care. And to be fair, they really shouldn't care because you're making a product and they're paying you for that product. Okay, so I'm getting some messages here suggesting that I try to reduce resolution. So here's what we're going to do, guys. Okay, I reduced the bit rate. It seems like it might be improving a little bit. I know there's a fair bit of lag in my stream going out and your chat coming in, but if reducing the bit rate has helped, then I'll leave it alone. If you think I should drop resolution, then tell me, and then I'll kill the stream for a minute, and then we'll restart it. So otherwise, I'll keep going. So my point in that is that it's really important for us as makers of games to remember that from a business perspective, the only thing that really matters is that someone's going to pay us for that thing. And I'm not saying that that means you should be unfaithful to the vision of your design. It doesn't mean that you should make garbage that will just get money out of people. I mean, some people do that, and we can talk about that another time. But it's important. Okay. So Troy's suggesting I can just talk about the biz side. I'm going to keep going with this. I think it's an important thing to think about as designers. It's important to remember that at the end of the day, people give you money because you showed them a good time. I mean, that's an incredibly broad statement, but that is really what we do. We show people a good time, and they give us money. And if you want to keep doing this, if you want to be able to do this work for a long time and do better and better work and more ambitious work, you need to find ways to get people to want to keep giving you money. And I know that sounds a little crass, but it's really just practical. Without consumers paying us for what we do, we don't get to do it. And so I've always tried to remind myself that, and it's not just really about design, it's about everything. At the end of the day, what matters is that the people who are paying us feel rewarded for having done that. And that can happen in a lot of different ways. I mean, you can enlighten people, you can challenge them, and then show them that they can do more than they ever thought they could do. There's a bunch of ways you can succeed at that. But at the end of the day, if you don't get them to come along with you, then you haven't really succeeded. So through the lens of design, I think that starts to inform certain things about how you think about your design. It doesn't mean that there's a single answer. It doesn't mean that there's a single approach. It does mean that you have to think really hard about why am I doing what I'm doing and who's actually going to care. So to finish out the thought, the other big bucket of design versus the business is on the implementation side. And I know Troy has talked about this in a lot of his course material because it's a really critical piece of the puzzle. The way you approach design, and it's not just design, it's the way you approach making a game has a profound effect on what it's going to cost you to do it and how long it's going to take and how likely you are to get it right. A simple example of that is simply if you sort of wave your hands and say, oh, we're going to do this amazing visual experience where everything looks absolutely realistic and you're always in this completely interactive environment and everything you touch reacts just the way it does in the real world. I mean, that sounds good if you say it fast, but the reality is the hardware probably won't let you do that. So you have to start finding ways to achieve the essence of what you're trying to do without tackling something that is literally impossible. And actually, Troy makes a good point. He comments that most execs don't either. And boy, oh boy, is that true. And maybe I should segue into that a little bit. So here's a thing about the game biz. And I'll start by observing that there have been lots and lots of people who have sort of postulated that games are a lot like movies and television. That's both true and completely untrue. So what do I mean by that? Well, it's untrue because the thing we make isn't a movie or a TV show. Excuse me. There are properties of what we make that might resonate with movies and TV, but they're not the same thing. And nobody who's actually made either one of those for any length of time really believes that they're the same. The crossover can be really interesting and it can be really useful, but they're distinctly different products with distinctly different purposes and distinctly different use cases. The simple example of that is that movies are largely passive. Yeah, I know. There's the Dark Mirror thing, blah blah blah. That's a choose your own adventure movie, ish. So I mean, it's a cute idea, but honestly, guys, to call that a game is kind of silly. So movies and television, for the most part, as defined right now, are largely passive experiences. You can control how people think. You can control what people see and hear. You have the ability to craft their experience in a very careful way. And that could be an amazing experience. But games don't have that luxury. In a game, you have to be ready to take on just about anything a player throws at you. So they're not the same thing. Okay, well, so how are they the same? Well, partly they're the same because of the way you get graded and what you have to do to make them. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's start with the getting graded part. So entertainment in general gets graded on largely subjective criteria. What does that mean? Well, was it fun? Did I have a good time? Do I want to keep playing it? Those are the kinds of things that we live and die by, right? So, I mean, think about that for a second, right? So it's not like we're not making Excel, right? Where if the new version of Excel passes this suite of mathematical tests, then it's okay. There's like all this subjective stuff that we have to succeed at, and there's no manual that says if I do this, people will do that. There are rules. There's wisdom. There's a bunch of information that's available to you that will help you make smarter decisions about how to achieve a positive result. But at the end of the day, it's all subjective. And it reminds me a little bit of what Stephen King said about writing. He talks about writing as being kind of like telepathy, that if you're doing it right, you can kind of make things happen in people's heads without them realizing you're doing it. And games are very much the same way. If you do that in a skillful way, people will love your game and they will come back and play it a lot. If you don't, well, you're probably not going to garner that much of an audience. So the point I'm making there is that there is a sort of similarity in that respect between games and a lot of other forms of entertainment. There is also a sort of demographic overlap, right? There are plenty of people who play certain kinds of games who also tend to watch certain kinds of movies. So there's a lot of reasons on the sort of marketing side to want to find a way to take advantage of those overlaps. And that's where, movie license games kind of come into play. And sometimes that works really well, and sometimes not so much. If you take a look at the Lord of the Rings games, the Harry Potter games, the James Bond games at Electronic Arts, those all made a lot of money, in part because they resonated with the audiences that also went to see the movies. So that's a good thing. But, did the King Kong game make a lot of money, despite the fact that it was universally seen as a pretty damn good game? Not really. And we could spend 2 hours talking about why. But my point is, there are certain kinds of movie game tie-ins that seem to actually work pretty well, and there are other ones that are really hard to do. So the other thing that kind of overlaps between other forms of entertainment and games is the discipline of production. So what do I mean by that? Well, anybody who's been around movies or TV, and I know some of you have, you know that a well-run production can hit its dates, be ready when it needs to be done at a sufficiently high quality that the audience will feel like they got what they expected. It's never certain, but you can run a project in a way that makes it possible to be largely successful at getting the thing done when you said you would do it at the cost you predicted. Doesn't always work. Sometimes things go badly sideways. Actually, when I was at Sega, we worked on a Jurassic Park project, and at one point we got this email from Kathleen Kennedy, who was a producer on the project, and they had been on location on the Big Island in Hawaii, and they'd just gotten slammed by a hurricane, and literally every set they had built was gone. So it's like, well, now what do I do? Well, you find a way, right? That's what you do in production, and it happens in games too. So the discipline of production, there's a fair bit of overlap. Not everything is the same. Oh, sorry guys, I've got a kitty invasion going here. I think he's hungry. Oh, sorry. Yes, I know you're hungry. I'll feed you in a minute. One of the differences between games and linear entertainment forms, with respect to how production is unique around games. Oh, sorry guys. Is that in games there are often situations where there are things you don't know about how the game works yet, right? Especially if you're trying to create an improvement or a variation in a certain kind of gameplay. Maybe you understand the basics, but there are things you're doing that you're not really sure how they're going to work. So you have to do some prototyping, and that activity can often be kind of squishy with respect to how long it takes and how hard it is and how many people have to be involved and what it's going to cost. That particular activity doesn't really take place in movies, but there are parallels, right? I'll go back to Jurassic Park. So one of the problems that they had to solve was, how do I make realistic looking dinosaurs? And we want to raise the bar so high that nobody for a long time is going to be able to say that those dinosaurs didn't look real. That had never been done before. And so there was a lot of pre-production that happened on Jurassic Park that involved doing things like, well, let's try mechanicals. Oh, that didn't look that great. Okay, let's try CG. Well, that looks okay if you don't get too close. Well, let's try stop motion. I mean, they literally tried everything. They came up with everything they could think of to depict dinosaurs in a believable way. And none of them were perfect. So, not surprisingly, they ended up using all of them, but in specific cases, right? So there were, mechanical tyrannosaur heads, and there were literally puppets. There were CG Dilophosaurs, and there were CG, I forget what the big ones were called. They're not Brontosaurs, I forget. Sorry guys, I've forgotten what those things were called. They had to use what they had to create the impression they needed, and in a fairly complicated, kind of messy way. Well, that happens all the time in games too. And so from a business perspective, one of the challenges that a guy like me, who moved into the executive ranks and had to be responsible for big sacks of money not getting burned up the wrong way, you had to start figuring out, well, how the hell am I going to do that in a way that's in any way controllable? And that turns out to be one of the big challenges that people in responsible positions in the game business have to face every day. And so those of you who know me, some of you do, you're going to see that, or you will have heard me say that in the game biz, most executives operate from a position of fear. And what I mean by that is that they're usually scared pretty much all the time. Well, that's why. Because there's this giant bag of unknowns on every project. There's this giant bag of unknowns, all of which will cost lots of money. And unless you get your arms around those in a way that allows you to produce greatness without running out of money, you're potentially facing a really serious problem. And people get fired over this stuff, right? I mean, whole careers have just evaporated because somebody spent too much money at the wrong time. I'll give you one brief example. I'm sure all of you guys have heard of THQ. They were around for a long time. They made a lot of games. There was a time when they were trying to reinvent their brand. And they wanted to position THQ as a genuine, stands next to Blizzard and Naughty Dog, AAA producer of games. And so the mantra was fewer, bigger, better. We're going to make fewer games, we're going to spend more money making them, and we're going to make them amazing. And everybody at that company was on board with that. I mean, they really, really wanted to do it, and they had a bunch of really talented people. They weren't dumb. But they made a couple of decisions about titles that they had in the pipeline that ended up not going their way. And as I imagine some of you know, THQ no longer exists. They ran out of money. And then they had to sell off assets of the company. And the last I heard, THQ, the brand was bought by, was it Starbreeze? I think it might have been Starbreeze. And it became THQ Nordic. So, best of intentions, big sack of money, still went sideways. And that's why executives in the game biz are scared all the time. Oh, okay, by the way, that's true of music executives, it's true of TV executives, it's true of movie executives. They all live in that world. One false step, and they're toast. So those of us who have worked on the front lines making the game, you know, when we're grousing about executives not getting it, well, that may be true. They may not get it, but it's entirely possible that whatever madness they're asking you to participate in, it may not be capricious. It may simply be driven by the fact that they're like, if I don't get this thing under control, they're just going to shoot me. And that does happen. It happens all the time. So, by the way, I'm not making excuses for executives. I always thought I was pretty good in that role, but the amount of risk that I had to work with was enormous. And one false step, and that would be it, right? You step on the landmine, and suddenly you're not there anymore. So, I guess what I would say is that for me, the game business has been a really fascinating evolution, right? I mean, we started out early in this stream. I started talking about the fact that you know, when I got into the business, teams consisted of like, you know, 2 guys, and when I tried to retire a few years back and failed at it, but we'll talk about that another time. You know, some teams were up into the multiple hundreds of people. I mean, when I was at EA, I ran teams that were more than 200 people, and in some cases were scattered over 3 or even 4 locations around the globe. So that evolution has been enormous. Well, why does that happen? What is it? I mean, why do games cost 10, 20, 50, 100, 200, 300 million dollars to make? Why is that? You could make a game for $10. Well, actually, these days you might actually be able to make a game for $10. But AAA games, frontline games, the games that everybody hears about, cost enormous amounts of money. Well, why is that? Well, it's because the number of people that have to be involved has gone up exponentially. Well, why is that? Because the things that you can put in a game have evolved enormously. Go back to 1990 and ask yourself, how many pixels do I have to fill on the screen? Well, the answer is, you know, a few tens of thousands. The total space available in a game from the early 90s on the cartridge that it was stuffed into might have been a few megabytes. Well, what are we looking at now? I mean, geez, I've got, on my dev box, I've got, I don't know, like 6 terabytes of storage, and I'm running out of space. And that's not even counting my external SSD that I put all my Steam games on, which is 2 terabytes, and it's almost out of space. So just the sheer volume of data that we can stuff into a game now is enormous. Well, it's not just that, right? I mean, yeah, there's a ton of data we can stuff into it, but why is it so big? Well, those of you who are or have been a part of CG Spectrum's modeling or animation tracks, you know why. Because when you start building high fidelity 3D assets with a lot of animation, suddenly the footprint of those assets gets really, really big. And it's not ever going to go the other way. It's never going to get smaller. Oh, and now we got to deal with ray tracing. We don't even know how to do that. I mean, we know how to do it, but we don't really know what that means in terms of production yet. And the list goes on and on. So my point is, these things have gotten bigger and more complex because the technology that we use to put them in front of people has gotten vastly more capable. So, I mean, all of this is really tied to Moore's law, right? The the rule of thumb about the doubling of horsepower every 10 years. Actually, it's been more like every 3 years for a long time, and then it's kind of flattened out a little bit. And, it's an approximation, but it makes an excellent point. The horsepower of the devices we use to entertain ourselves now is so large that it makes it possible for us to use enormous amounts of data, complex animations, physics, and all the other things that go into modern video games. And interestingly to me, not only has that made just the production volume a bigger deal, it also challenges every other discipline in what we do. It makes the designer's job more complicated. It makes the sound guy's job more complicated. It makes the producer's job more complicated. All of those things get more demanding because of what's possible. One of the things that I find really interesting about indie games, now I'm shifting gears on you guys here. Indie games were kind of seen as this nostalgic kind of move back toward the simplicity of games from 20 or even 30 years ago. And there's some of that in there. But that's not the only thing that makes indie games interesting. It's also, I think, a reminder that with a game, just the sophistication of the assets, while it can have a really big effect on how people perceive the game, it's not why the game exists. So, I've talked about all this money and big teams and complexity and all this stuff, and all of that stuff is true. I mean, that's the business we're in now. But at the end of the day, it isn't why games exist. And I think from any position in the business of games, it's possible to ask yourself that question. Why am I making the game this way? Why is it this way? What purpose does it have? If I fold that back into independent games, which are smaller, visually simpler, often very tightly focused on a particular mode of gameplay, and yet some of them are enormously entertaining and immensely popular, I think it's useful to ask yourself, well, why are they so popular when they're that simple? And I think what it comes down to is something that Troy talks about a lot, which is gameplay. Well, what is that? And why does it make a difference? I'm going to give you the really simple kind of Scot version of that, because Troy goes into a lot of depth about what gameplay is and why it matters and how to use it as a tool for creating an experience. But from my kind of game executive perspective, it comes down to, in the moment, am I having a good time? Do I like pushing that button a lot? Do I like manipulating the controls in this way? Can I keep doing that and feel rewarded in the right ways? And if the answer is yes, then you may have something. I mean, take a step back and think about Flappy Bird. I mean, come on, guys. Flappy Bird, it's barely a game, except, no, actually it is a game. And it was enormously successful because there was something kind of compelling about what you did in Flappy Bird. I'm not saying it's the greatest game that ever was. What I'm saying is, it's like, I kind of like doing this. I kind of like doing this a lot. Oh, I messed up. I'm going to do it again. That, in a way, is an expression of kind of that pure essence of gameplay, and I think is an example of how powerful that can be. Anybody who's played Tetris as much as I have knows that sometimes very simple mechanics can be very compelling. And I think that's a thing that is unique about the product we make. So I'll tie that off. What does that mean? Well, it means that there's nothing wrong with going AAA. In fact, there's a lot that can be right about it. But I think when you go AAA and you spend the big bucks on complex animations and lots of dialogue and sound effects and uniquely composed music and it's important that you never lose sight of what's that little thing you're doing moment to moment, because that's the thing people are going to be doing most of the time that they're around your game. And if they like it, all of that other stuff becomes kind of an enhancer for the experience. If they don't like it, none of that other stuff is going to matter. So, in a way, it's actually kind of simple, except it's really not. It's actually pretty hard. And I don't think all organizations that make and publish games or fund and publish games really embrace that. They get caught up in other stuff, and you can kind of tell, as a consumer, you can kind of tell who those guys are, right? Take a look at the current reaction to Electronic Arts games. And by the way, I'm not bagging on Electronic Arts. I spent many years there. I still have friends there. There's a lot of good things to say about EA. But of late, their behavior has been driven by attempts to improve the monetization of the games they make. And I think in some cases, that's caused them to sort of forget what those games are for. And so the moment-to-moment experience isn't necessarily as compelling. And then also, in some fashion, the game is demanding more money from you in order to lower the level of frustration that you're experiencing. That's not a great recipe. That usually leads to disaster, right? I mean, people aren't dumb, right? If you tell them, hey, I'm going to give you something that kind of sucks, but it'll suck a little less if you give me more money, well, some of them might bite down, but a lot of people are going to go, well, screw you. I'll just go over here and have a better time. And that's happened. Yes, you are absolutely correct. Hyper-casual mobile games, some of them have immense numbers of downloads, and some of them make immense amounts of money. They are kind of a different thing. And actually, I would love to do another live stream side by side with Troy when he's feeling better, to talk about the difference between those games and kind of the mainstream of games. I kind of hate to call it that, but I think you guys probably know what I mean. Those hyper-casual mobile games, I think, actually serve a different purpose, and they fire different neurons in the people that spend money on them. The learning experience for me around that difference came when I did some consulting work for a mobile slots company in Las Vegas. And that, I got to tell you guys, that was a real eye-opener. I learned a whole bunch of things I didn't know about human psychology and how, if you're both knowledgeable and, shall we say, ethically challenged, you can get people to give you money even when they don't want to do it. And I find that both fascinating and kind of chilling. So I'm not saying that those casual mobile games don't have a place in the ecosystem. Of course they do. But I think they're a different creature from the games I've made over the course of my career. And to be completely honest, I'm kind of glad about that. And by the way, I'm not saying that any of you should just categorically reject the opportunity to work on one of the games. It'll teach you a lot. Just understand that when you do that, it's a little bit like joining up with what's his name, the guy that owned the chicken restaurants in Breaking Bad. You're buying into a different thing, at least in my view. So, okay, I've blathered a lot about a lot of different things, and I appreciate you guys being patient with me and sticking around and listening in. We've got about 15 minutes before we're going to want to wrap up here. I'll keep talking, but if any of you guys have questions that you'd like to ask or things you'd like to challenge, I mean, to the extent that we can do it, I'd love to make this a little bit interactive and maybe poke at things that you guys would like to hear about. While I'm waiting for you guys to think about that, I'll suggest that in my opinion, this next generation of console hardware is going to be a really interesting transition in the business, because I think we're starting to approach one of those plateaus, and these happen every I don't know, 10, 15 years, where the technology of processing and presentation starts to kind of compress a little bit. You start getting into a situation where the next increment that the new hardware delivers is a little smaller than the previous increment. So it gets to be more challenging for those of us who make the product to showcase why PS5 over PS4. And please don't misunderstand me. When I look at some of the early stuff for PS5, I'm like, wow, that looks really, really good. But I think the distance between it and PS3 is a little smaller. And I think that's going to present a real challenge, especially for the smaller studios. Oh, yes. Yeah, so Troy just pointed out that he's made some free-to-play games, and so have I. And Troy and I both come from the same school. I think the things that free-to-play games need from a business perspective are things that we find slightly repugnant. You really are manipulating people into giving you more money. And it can be done a lot of different ways. And actually, Troy knows much more about this than I do. I kind of understand it at the superficial level. Troy understands it much more deeply than I do. But I think we both recognize that free-to-play games are largely about kind of two things. Not mechanics. I'm talking about human psychology. One of those things is little endorphin hits. If you can get somebody's brain to pop a little endorphin at the right time, that's good for you, because that means they're going to like whatever it is going on. And the other one is about frustration. So it's a little bit of a carrot and a stick, right? I got the carrot. It's called endorphin. and I got the stick, it's called frustration. That could be done with grinding. It could be done with having a harder time winning. It can be done a lot of different ways. But that frustration can be used to nudge people over the line, right? So you give them a little taste. Ooh, I like that. I liked winning. I liked watching those wheels spin into place and money falling out of the virtual coin box. If you can then couple that onto a little bit of frustration so that your brain is saying, I want the endorphin, how do I get to it? Oh, crap, I can't get there fast enough. Okay, fine, I'll give you money. And yeah, Troy's also making a really good point about that growth from generation to generation of game platforms. At the end of the day, and this goes back to my little rant about indie games, what people really want from a game is that it plays in a way that rewards them or satisfies them. The graphical presentation, the speed of the animations, the smoothness of the smoothness is actually kind of an interesting one. Maybe I'll set that aside. The presentation, while hugely important, is not why we do it. So, yeah, I mean that's a real challenge for us those of us who make games, because we can invest a lot of time and money in presentation, and if we lose sight of the gameplay, we got a problem. And then to loop back on what Troy's talking about now with impatience. Yeah, impatience is a tremendously powerful tool. So when I talk about frustration, that's really what I'm talking about, because it really comes down to, I want the endorphin hit, give me the endorphin, bring me the crack, right? And then if you hold it back a little bit, they start getting itchy about it. And then if you tell them, oh, by the way, you can get the crack if you just give me something, that's where your conversion rate comes from, right? And in free-to-play games, it's all about conversion rates. Well, it's not just about conversion rates, but that's a big factor in your success. If you can get people to cross that threshold once, they'll do it again. And so it, honestly, guys, I mean, I hate to overstate the metaphor, but it is very much like that guy in the street saying, yeah, here's the first bag is free because you're going to come back. And I personally, I've just made a decision after working with that slots company that I'm just never going to do that again. I mean, I don't think they're bad people, really. I'm not going to do that. I actually kind of do think that the big companies in gambling are bad people. I mean, I had a fair amount of contact with some of those folks, and I'm like, wow, I would not let you come to my house for dinner because I really don't want to know you. You're not a good person. I'm sorry, that's kind of how I felt. There were good people in those organizations, but their purpose is to get people to behave in an addictive manner and give them money. That's what gambling is about. And anybody who tells you that it's anything else is either misinformed or deluded, or they're just lying. So yeah, I'm with Troy. I would not go back and do that again. Even if they offered me a big sack of money, I just wouldn't do it. I frankly would rather be poor than go back and be a part of that. So, okay, well, we got 10 minutes left, guys. If there's anything else that you might want to touch on, now's your chance. If not, I'm just going to prattle on for another 10 minutes. So that moment-to-moment thing, I actually find that really fascinating. And one of the things that I think I've noticed, I mean, this is me just kind of observing, and again, this is a thing that actually, I think there are people like Troy who are more deeply knowledgeable about the business in some ways than I am, who I think would have a more sophisticated opinion about it. But from my perspective, it looks to me as if there really are very few actual unique game forms in the business. And what I mean by that is, shooters, driving games, platformers, If you think about it, when was the last time that a new game form was invented? So I'm going to leave that as an exercise for the viewer. Actually, Pat just asked a really interesting question, so I'm going to shift over to that. So the notion of cloud gaming, in my view, is an incredibly powerful one. Here's the problem. And I've been around every generation of cloud gaming technology that exists. Actually know Dave Perry pretty well. I was one of his first sort of test case executives when he was trying to put Gaikai together. And his demo was freaking awesome. I mean, it was really impressive. Dave is a showman, and it showed. But the reality is, for the average consumer, unless you have a big fat pipe, and by big fat pipe, I mean at least 500 megabits down, and you have reliably low latency, and you have reliably high packet retention rates, and your data rates don't vary that much, and there's about 12 other things that you can add to that list, cloud gaming will suck. And I think that's what people are seeing. It happened with, yes, latency is the death of gaming online. And it's not just with cloud gaming, guys. I mean, look at every online game you've ever played, right? Rainbow Six Siege, for I don't know, probably 60% of their audience, is still horrible, right? You've got peak deaths, you've got latency deaths. Death by lag in Rainbow Six Siege happens all the time. Well, why is that? Because it's really hard to create a consistent experience, especially when the rate at which you have to make decisions in a game like that is higher than the latency that the game suffers. It's really tough. In fact, one would argue that it's largely impossible. There's a reason, for example, that Blizzard designed World of Warcraft so that you can't do anything faster than once a second. Why would you do that? It's really simple. Because most of the time, you can keep your latency under 1,000 milliseconds. And if you do, then that experience doesn't break. But what if you're playing a fast-paced shooter like Call of Duty or Rainbow Six Siege or whatever, and you've got to make a decision, within 150 milliseconds, or you're toast? Well, if it happens to lag out while you're making that decision, you are toast. So I personally think Google Stadia and the rest of those platforms, great idea, too soon. I don't think the infrastructure is ready for it. I don't think it's going to be ready for it for quite some time. There are things you can do to make it better. There are numerical techniques you can use. There are latency masking techniques you can use. And we did that when I was at Capcom with Street Fighter 2, right? We got with the guy who created GTPO, and we created a custom version and stuck it in Street Fighter 2, and it worked, right? But the reason it worked as well as it did is because Street Fighter 2 is actually a very deterministic game, despite what you might think. And as a consequence, we could make that into a great experience. But if it was a 4-player game instead of a 2-player game, the whole thing would have just come flying apart. So I just don't think we're ready. And yes, worldwide differences in bandwidth are right there at the top of the list. It's going to be a while before we overcome that. Will we eventually? Yeah, of course we will eventually. It's just like with VR. Eventually, all of those technical issues will get sorted out. The weight of HMDs will go down, blah, blah, blah. All that stuff's going to happen. But these are hard problems because they're not really science problems. Well, some of them might be. Latency, the way the internet is constructed, latency is going to be a hard one to get rid of. But someone will eventually figure it out. Someone will eventually come up with a way to keep latencies really low everywhere in the world. Someone will eventually come up with a way to put a gigabit in the hands of everybody on the planet, no matter what their device is. That's all going to happen. But right now, in my experience with Google Stadia is basically boils down to yuck. Why would I do that? But as Troy points out, slower paced games can succeed. That's why World of Warcraft, which was built in 2004, is still, I would say, eminently playable in 2020. That's one of the longest set of legs I've ever seen on a game, and part of it is because it was designed to be very forgiving about the environment in which it operates. Can you do other kinds of games? Of course you can. You can do card games, you can do word games, and all those things. There are lots of multiplayer game experiences that can work well in a highly variable online environment. But there are some kinds of games that people really want to play. I mean, I spent, I don't know, the better part of 4 years being a fanatic about World of Tanks. Why? I don't know. I just really enjoyed playing it. And I got pretty good at it. I was never a unicorn, but I was getting up there. But ultimately, I gave up on it because the frustration of that highly variable online environment was sometimes just too much for me. I was demanding more from myself as a player, and it was getting harder and harder to rely on my skill rather than the limitations of the system. And at some point, that became frustrating enough for me that I'm like, I just don't want to do this anymore. I hate being angry all the time. And I think that happens, right? And there are lots of people who do play high performance online games, but they do it with the help of technologies that most people don't know about, bother with, or have the money to pay for, right? I mean, you can pay for a low latency connection, and that helps. And yes. So Troy's pointing out that one game design session, I think you're probably talking about World of Warcraft, actually made the game possible, and that is true, right? I mean, the goal of that game was to be able to put hundreds of people on the same server, and at the time, especially given the state of connectivity at the time, that would have been almost impossible without that design decision. And this kind of loops back onto the place I started with this whole stream. There are design decisions you can make that have a profound effect on how successful you can be delivering the experience you're after. And by the way, Blizzard used to be one of my go-to examples of a studio that did that really well. But they did it at a very high price. The number of times those guys killed a project because they said, we're never going to get this right, we just have to stop and do something else, is kind of stunning. They tried over and over and over on some games and finally just said, screw it, we're never going to get this right, and they walked away from it. World of Warcraft actually emerged from the ashes of other games that didn't work, as did Overwatch, right? I mean, that was their pattern. And sometimes they spent lots and lots and lots of money trying to get there. And sometimes they just had to say, no, this is never going to be right. The problem for Blizzard is they're not that Blizzard anymore. They can't really be that Blizzard anymore. The people, the leadership who made Blizzard that way, they've all moved on. I mean, Alan Adam is still there, but virtually everybody else is gone, including Mike Morhaime. And Mike Morhaime is a really interesting cat. He's one of the most unassuming people I've ever met. He's also one of the most fearless people I've ever met. And you would never really know that to talk to him. He's just a regular guy. He's really smart, but he's just a guy who plays bass in a mediocre metal band and really likes playing certain kinds of games and will talk to you endlessly about them. But the guy is fearless, and I watched him be fearless. When it mattered. I sat at a company offsite after his company and my company got bought by Sierra, and he stood up there and said, "We're not shipping StarCraft." And the whole room got really quiet. And there were people looking at each other like, well, I wonder if he's going to walk out of this room on his own feet or on a stretcher. Uh, that courage is why Blizzard is the brand it is today. And it wasn't just him. It was all of those guys, right? But it is unbelievably hard to say no like that when you need to. And the guys at Blizz were really good at it. They're not the only ones. There are other studios that are as good at that as Blizzard used to be. BioWare used to be that way too, but it was the docs, right? Those two guys were the ones who would say, no, it's not right. And if it wasn't right, it didn't go. When they left, that changed. I'm not blaming anybody. It's nobody's fault. It is what it is. There are very few people who have both the courage and the ability to speak in a compelling way to get other people to go along with making that decision, because those decisions are really scary and hard. And a lot of times people don't want to make them. So, you know, what that comes down to from a business perspective is that doing that top 1% work is really challenging. And that's the thing I'd love to talk about in the future. So we're now over time. I have blathered on too long. Thanks, you guys. It's been hugely entertaining for me. I really hope I get a chance to do this again. And Troy, I hope you feel better soon, dude. So I think I'm going to ring off, and hopefully I'll see you guys all again soon.